allow me to introduce our presenters for this afternoon's panel. Boston-born Dan Brotman is the new executive director of the Windsor Jewish Federation and Community Center. Canada is his third immigration in 15 years, having made Aliyah to Israel straight after high school and then spending the past decade living in South Africa. He has visited 68 countries to date and has had the privilege of spending time with some of the world's most far-flung Jewish communities. Gustavo Rymberg was born and raised in Argentina, but his Jewish professional journey began in Winnipeg. In 1997, his young family were among the first Argentinian immigrants brought to the city under the Jewish community's Grow Winnipeg initiative. His deep appreciation of the Jewish Federation led him on a career path that took him to Ottawa, Toronto, and now Hamilton, where he serves as the CEO of Hamilton Jewish Federation. Joe Roberts is an organizational leader, development expert, and former political operative with over 15 years of strategic leadership experience. Currently serving as the executive director of Jewish London, he previously served as global chief advancement officer at the Israel Project in Washington, D.C., vice president of major gifts at the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. And now I'll hand it over to Dan Brotman.
Hi, everyone, and thank you again for coming to our session. Limud Toronto is actually very different this year, as we all know, in that it has gone virtual. And we saw this as a really great opportunity for us to showcase smaller Jewish communities in Ontario. I'm actually just going to share this with all of you. So the title of our presentation is From Three Continents to Three Small Jewish Communities in Ontario. So we're going to be speaking about, myself, Gustavo, and Joe, both about where we come from, as well as the smaller communities in Ontario that we move to and the federations that we lead. One interesting fact that I came across is that 30% of Canadian Jews are immigrants, according to the 2018 survey of Jews in Canada. And this is actually a higher proportion than immigrants in Canada overall, which is 22%. We're going to go in order of who has been in Canada the longest, and we're going to be covering three main questions. So the first one is, where do we come from? And can we talk about the uniqueness of our home Jewish community? The second question is to talk about our experience immigrating to Canada and settling into a smaller Jewish community in Ontario. And the third is on the challenges, opportunities, and vision for our adoptive Jewish communities here in Canada. So we're going to start with Gustavo, and Gustavo will be telling me when to change the slides.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's nice to recognize a lot of familiar faces. So thank you for all of you who knows me from my previous life to be here. Great. And okay, let's start where I'm coming from. And I think that we can, there you are. And where I'm coming from and why I'm using this picture. Every time that I have a conversation, someone is asking me how I choose this professional life, I always show this picture. Why? It's my first contact with community life from Argentina. This is, that happened in 1984. It's a trip that what at that time was the kind of the Jewish Federation from Buenos Aires organized to Israel. And that was a trip that really changed my life. It's visiting Israel with 21 kids, you know, all of us were 16 years old. We spent 2 hours living in a kibbutz, volunteering in a kibbutz, and touring Israel for 2 weeks. So that opened my eyes to a very new reality of what is Jewish life, very different from what I used to have, you know, during my previous year attending Jewish schools. So being in Israel by myself, being with a group of people, volunteering in a kibbutz, show me what community is. And that was my first big life change, I would say, related to Jewish life. And also on that trip, I met my wife, Marisa. We're still married. I mean, we're together for almost 30 years. So that trip really changed my life. And next one. And where I'm coming from. Okay, so as you know, Buenos Aires is one of the biggest Jewish communities in Latin America. Today, there's like 250,000 Jews living in Buenos Aires. And despite all the different economic situations, dictatorial governments, political fluctuations, it's remarkable what the Jewish community accomplished in Argentina. Today, after all those crises, there's like 70 synagogues in Argentina, 20 day schools, 4 JCCs, and this is the only kosher McDonald's outside Israel. But why I started presentation with this picture, this was the old Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires. And that was the day that March 17, 1992 was the day that changed. I started to change about Jewish life in Buenos Aires. You know, that's the bomb to the Israeli embassy, and that's the next picture, where 29 people were killed. 2 years later, the Jewish Federation of Buenos Aires, what we call the AMIA, it's the next picture. 2 years later, another terrorist attack killed 85 people in Argentina. And that's the picture that you have now. So that was like that was the original building. The first synagogue in Argentina was built in 1862. So it's a very, very old Jewish community and very powerful, very active. But we have these 2 incidents, and you can show the next picture, Dan. After this, you know, Marisa and I, we were very young. We were like 28 years old, 2 young kids, and we decided to say, to find another ways and a better Jewish life. That's not what we want. That's not what we want for our kids. And we started to think basically to move to Israel. But by accident, totally accidentally, we heard that the Jewish community in Winnipeg were looking for young families in Buenos Aires to move to Winnipeg under the program Grow Winnipeg. You can skip some pictures. That's, yeah. One more, okay. So, and a couple of years after, through the Jewish community, the Jewish Federation in Winnipeg, we moved to Winnipeg. We left Argentina in January in the middle of the summer, 36 degrees. We arrived to Winnipeg with minus 36 degrees. Like, the shock was like incredible. But this picture for me is very special because these are the 4 families who moved to Winnipeg under this program, the Grow Winnipeg program. And I spent in Winnipeg a lot of years, like 9 beautiful years. It was like an amazing, amazing Jewish community. After that, I moved to Ottawa, working again for the Jewish Federation in Ottawa. After Ottawa, I moved to Toronto. And after Toronto, for the past three and a half years, I'm working as a CEO in the Jewish Federation in Hamilton. So next picture, Dan. Yeah. But something important happened in the middle was like, after 4 years being in Canada, we became citizens. And that was like a remarkable moment. I don't know, Joe, if you will go through that or not, we'll see. But it was like something that I was looking for a long time. After the destruction in Argentina, after the terrorist attack, after the difficult situations, you know, we achieved something really big that changed our life forever. And most importantly, give our kids something that they will never lose and they will keep forever. And it's the best investment that we did in our life, giving them the Canadian citizenship and the opportunities that Canada can give it to them. So next one. Okay, so now let's talk about the experience coming to Winnipeg, Ottawa, Toronto, and Hamilton. Was like all very good communities and all very different communities. I really believe that I never worked for in the CEO position for the other communities, but I learned a lot from the other communities. I learned that every community in Canada has similarities and very, very different needs. Winnipeg was the the community that opened me the doors to Canada and actually opened me the doors to learn about Jewish community life. I arrived to Winnipeg in a very special moment for the community, where they were developing new campuses, new Jewish education, great initiative. But after that, I have an opportunity to move to Ottawa to work in a higher position. At that point, I decided to make my life in the Jewish professional world. So I accept and I move until I come to Hamilton. But being in Hamilton gave me a very special opportunity to connect with people in a different way, to understand the community in different way. So it's a community of 5,000 Jews, three synagogues, 2-day schools, 2 after-school programs for students in 2 of the synagogues. It's a very vibrant community, very different from the other ones. We are very close to Toronto, and sometimes, we have like pros and cons, but overall gave me the opportunity to connect with people in different way and to make some changes. And I think that was one of the opportunities and good things about being in small communities, that you connect with people almost one-on-one, and the people know you one-on-one. And you can make a difference by being yourself and working hard for the Jewish community. During my first year in Hamilton, I have a great opportunity to go to a JFNA, Jewish Federations of North America mission to Berlin and Budapest. And that was for me like another important moment in my career, because this picture, it's for you like maybe it's like 6-7 people standing and an old guy there, but the old guy who is sitting there is a Holocaust survivor living in Budapest, alone, blind, with no family, and now no one is taking care of him. But why we're visiting him? We visit him because he was part of what the Jewish Distribution Committee is doing in Europe for Jewish communities as well. And we are a small community, but for me it was very important to know that we can make a difference, also outside of Hamilton. And that day I have like a very important click in my mind, because for one moment I realized, okay, you know what, this guy, okay, he's a Holocaust survivor. We are not Holocaust survivors, but we are always going to be on the same risk to be alone. No one is going to be taking care of us, but we always know that there is a Jewish Federation or Jewish Distribution Committee or any Jewish organization, doesn't matter if it's a big or small community, someone who's taking care of old people and seniors and people who is alone. But the other slide that I like to show you is like the same trip, the totally opposite experience. I'm dancing on top of the table in a camp, in a Jewish camp in Budapest. So that's happened the same day. So in one day, I have the opportunity to realize, okay, this is what my job means. And this is the difference that we are doing. We're affecting the entire spectrum of Jewish life, all ages, all generations, doesn't matter where you live. Again, doesn't matter if it's a small, big, or large, or intermediate community, you can make a difference, from daycare, Jewish summer camp, to be a senior and Holocaust survivor. And for me, that was when I make a click and how important is the job that we are doing, like by volunteering, by being CEOs, making a donation, whatever connection we find with our federations, that's what it's for, to continue the circle of Jewish life. Okay, and again, so being in another great opportunity, like working for the Hamilton Jewish Federation, was the opportunity to attend the GA show. We were there together 2 years ago. And again, it's creating another important connection. Number one, it's an incredible connection when you travel together with people from your community. In this case, in the picture, it's like Larry Levin and Chucky Levin. Chuck is a president of our board, and Larry at that time was a board member. But traveling to Israel together with your community, with your president, the person that is your partner in making changes, was like really, really special. And being at the GA with communities all over the world in North America, make your work also very, very, very meaningful. So next step, next slide is like, okay, so what's happening in Hamilton today? So as I mentioned before, Hamilton is a community of 5,000 Jewish people, approximately. You know, there is a lot of new families moving to Hamilton right now. Everyone knows how expensive it is to live in Toronto. So Hamilton is a great option for these young families, young professionals. There is a lot of people coming to work at McMaster University, a lot of people from Israel coming to work or doing some residencies in McMaster University. So when I started like 3 years ago, you know, we face a new reality, new president of the board, a new CEO, and I think, you know, it's really time to start to set up new priorities and new goals, and reevaluate the goals that we have in the past if they are accurate today. So we went through a very, very complex and very interesting focus group process, strategic planning process, and we realized that not in any particular order, these are our 3 priorities for the Federation in Hamilton. Protecting the vulnerable in Hamilton, Israel, and around the world, educating, engaging, and strengthening our Jewish community, supporting and advocating for Israel and Jewish issues. So we are not doing this alone. We're working with the different organizations. We can have here in more detail how we are planning to accomplish each of these goals. And again, the good things about this is like they are goals that you can change the priorities, you know, like in this year, for example, supporting the vulnerable is our #1 priority for reasons that everyone know. You know, the way that COVID affected our community and other communities, you know, was very, very unexpected. And suddenly we face that we have new vulnerable people that was never vulnerable before or was never part of that group. People that they cannot leave houses, people that they cannot go to the groceries, people that they cannot do regular things. So all these goals and all these priorities are, you know, they can move around. And next year, I hope we finish with COVID and another priority will take the first position. But this is our goals, and how, you know, what do we need in order to accomplish them for the next 3 years are these four things. You know, we really have to grow, and I think that one of the challenges that every small community in Ontario is facing right now is growing the annual community campaign. I think that it's time to be more creative. It's a very difficult time, but we have to attract the young generations. We have to think different about making a donation to the Federation. We have to, in our case, our infrastructure is not the same as Windsor and London. We don't have a campus, or we don't have like a complex where the Jewish community concentrates. So we have to secure that. That's something that it's missing in Hamilton for now. And we are going to make an extra effort to build the existing endowment and giving funds. And what we are doing also is we try to develop a stronger volunteer base, not only for boards and canvassing, but also to be part of the community. We're small communities, we rely in volunteers a lot to do work that in other federations of bigger size will have like paid positions to do that. So those are our main challenges, I will say, and that's where we are now. We're working very hard. Unfortunately, a lot of things change with COVID, but we're very optimistic. Our campaigns are, our annual campaign is growing, it's doing well, but we never know. And there's always new challenges that we have to face. But I will leave now to Joe, I think.
Yes. Sorry, so I'm just gonna skip this just in the interest of time. Joe, over to you.
Okay. Right. So I'm Joe Roberts. I am the executive director at Jewish London, which is the London Jewish Community Federation and the JCC. Also, I lead the foundation as the professional person there as well. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio, which is a small community. When I was growing up, had about 2,000 Jews. Now has about 900, something like that. It's shrunk quite a bit in the last 20 or so years. And it's funny to me because I think about this a lot, how where I grew up and where I live now. And Dayton, in a lot of ways, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, felt like London does today. It was a pretty nice little town. It was, it was a kind of a industrial center here in London. Still our number one industry is manufacturing. And then everything changed there. So we kind of saw manufacturing fall away. We had the worst job loss in 2008. We had the worst job loss in 4 consecutive quarters than anywhere else, any other city in North America. And so we had 6 Fortune 500 companies headquartered in Dayton. We lost all of them. And so it really changed the face of the community. It really changed the faces of the Jewish community. And most of the young families left. Most of my friends growing up are gone. I don't think any of them live in Dayton now. Most have moved to Chicago, was kind of the regional center for us. And my own Jewish experience was a little different. I grew up completely secular on the other side of town from the Jewish community. I had never heard a Jewish prayer or been in a synagogue or a federation event until I was in university. And my parents were kind of social activists, and I really thought that going to marches and being involved in politics was Jewish. That's what Judaism was when I was a kid. And I went, actually, my whole path is a little bit non-traditional, but I went to the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And it's actually where I found Judaism. And probably one of the most warm, small, welcoming Jewish communities I've ever been a part of. A very small synagogue, had no rabbi. It was all lay-led. And I got very involved there, ended up being on the board. While I was in university, I taught Sunday school there. And it kind of put me on a Jewish path in a way that I wouldn't have had I gone to a big state school or something like that. And so I look at this and I think about, Dan asked, and we had this conversation to prep for this, and said, what community are you from? And I have a really hard time answering that question because Dayton was formative for me, but also Alaska, and also, the federations and the Jewish communities that I was involved with after that. I went into a career in politics actually first, and I worked in activism and electoral politics leading up into 2010. And I actually ran for United States Congress in my home district in Dayton, Ohio, and I was the Democratic nominee. And then if you know anything about the US politics, 2010 was a very ugly year for Democrats, and I lost and kind of said, what am I going to do now? I don't necessarily want to go work on somebody else's campaign. I was traveling 3, 6, 9 months a year. I took one last contract in Maine, and I was working there, and a friend actually said, you should apply at Federation. They're looking for people in Boston. I didn't actually even know what a federation was at the time. And so I put in an application, I sent my resume, and I interviewed, and happened that the woman who became my boss, my first boss in Federation, was a former political campaign person herself. And she said, this is a good fit for you. And I started working in Federation. Boston was absolutely amazing community, kind of one of the most progressive communities. And when I say progressive, I mean in the way that they do the business, the way that they think about Jewish life, the way that they approach engagement. And it was a great place to learn about organized Jewish life. I was under the impression, I was a young, obstinate person, and I thought that all federations were going to be the same. And so I ended up getting a call and from someone at the LA Federation and asked me to come out and think about interviewing and working there, and I did. And LA is a very, completely polar opposite community to Boston. And so, I think that going to Los Angeles, I learned that the makeup of the community was very different. So the way that we interacted with the community was very different. The politics were very different. You'd think Los Angeles would be progressive like Boston, but it wasn't. It was much more conservative, small c conservative in the way that it functioned. And the Federation was very much set in an older style of working, right? Federation movement started in 1895, actually in Boston. It was the first federation. And they had moved way beyond that. And some communities are still in a very traditional model. Los Angeles was one of them. And then I worked in Columbus, Ohio, a little bit closer to home, very much more like where I grew up and understood it and knew it. And it felt like going home for a while. And I made a switch in a few years ago, about 5 years ago now. I decided I wanted to go back into politics and work with something that blended my experience with Jewish life. And I took a position in Washington, D.C., working for the Israel Project. And it just wasn't, it wasn't the right fit for me. I completely missed working in the community. I really missed having the community aspect of my work, and I missed building that engagement at a community level. And the way that I heard about London is a very strange story. I was in Walt Disney World in Orlando, and it was a cold day, and I had only brought one sweatshirt in my bag. It was kind of my backup sweatshirt. It was a Roots Canada sweatshirt. And so every Canadian at Epcot Center would stop me and say, "Where are you from?" And it became kind of a joke because I'd say I'm not Canadian. But I ended up having coffee getting a coffee, sit down, and a couple came up and said, "Do you mind if we sit with you?" And we had started a really lovely conversation, talked for about a half an hour, and they asked me what I did for work, and it led to, I'm not sure what I'm going to be doing. I'm thinking about my next step. And the guy said to me, "I don't know what you do, but have you ever considered London, Ontario?" And I said, "No, I can promise you that I have not." And he asked, "Have you ever heard of London, Ontario?" And I said, "Yeah, it's the long stop on the via between Windsor and Toronto." And he kind of laughed and he said, "It's a beautiful community and we love it. We've been there 40 years. And I encourage you to check it out." And I went home and Googled Jewish London and saw that the position for executive director at the London community was available and open. And I thought, that's just too much of a happenstance not to inquire. And 3 months later, here I am in London, Ontario. So came up to visit, and honestly, I fell in love with this community. The people are incredible. The infrastructure here was really sound. I mean, we have a beautiful JCC with a 42-unit apartment building for seniors. We have 3 synagogues, Orthodox, Reform, and Conservative. We also have a Chabad on Western's campus and a Hillel on Western's campus. And we just have a really engaged group of people. And I think for me, when I came to London, what I noticed right away was everybody was excited about Jewish life. They weren't necessarily excited about all of the aspects of it, but they were excited about what we could become and what we could do together. And that was really, they were open to, there was an openness to kind of grow and to think differently about the work that we do as a community and as an organization. And so, I gave it some thought. Like I said, 3 months later, here I am, and I moved up to London. London was very different for me. I mean, learning a Canadian community in general, coming from the US, is very different. But then trying to figure out just what is this community and what do we know about it where do we even start? And so I really started to try to look at all of the data that we could collect about London. What do we actually know about the community? And really the last good set of data that we had was a Jewish census from 1996. So 14-year-old data. It said we had about 2,900 Jews in the community. And it had some good indicators. We were the youngest Jewish community in Canada at the time, which 14 years later should bode pretty well for us. We were mostly professional, kind of good things to be looking for, and the highest birth rate of any Jewish community in Canada in 1996. But looking at the community today, we didn't necessarily see the outcomes of that. So we didn't see a lot of 14-year-old kids. We also didn't see a lot of young families. And so, really trying to figure out how do we find those people, where are they, and what happened in that 14-year period. So, kind of looked at also the engagement rates within the Jewish community at the Federation and the JCC, and also at the synagogues. And we have about 1,000 people engaged in Jewish life, 900 to 1,000 people if you kind of combine everyone together. but it still didn't tell me how many people live in the community. What's our opportunity? And so did a little bit of work with the City of London. They had done a big study on kind of ethnic communities within the City of London and found they estimate our community to be about 7,500 Jews in London. I think that's high. I think we're probably somewhere in the 5,000 to 6,000 range. And we see that kind of line up percentage-wise with engagement rates in other communities if there's not a concerted effort to do outreach. So we think still, that the City of London has grown immensely. It's doubled in size in the last 15 years or so. And so we think that there is, someone just asked if we're factoring in students in that number. No, we don't include students in that number. Students are estimated at Western to be 2,000 to 3,000 students, but they're not included in that number. So, it's a good opportunity for us. We find that most of the unengaged Jews in London are young families, and they are newly moved here from Toronto. So not surprising. I often tell people, they say, well, people know where the Jewish community is. They're going to look us up. They're going to come see us. And that's not the case. We have to reach out and welcome these folks, because what we find is as they move to town, we're joining a synagogue may not be on their list if they're a young family, and we are being involved with the Jewish community probably falls somewhere in between. I got to get the kids signed up for school and I need to take the garbage out. So we actually have to do positive outreach to these folks to welcome them into the community and to get them involved. And that's really what we've done in my 3 years here, is to focus on reaching out and connecting and engaging with people at a deeper level. Not to say it wasn't happening before. There were incredible people working here before. The work was really good. There's a very, very engaged core group of Jews in London who are very involved and keep this community running on a volunteer basis. But just starting to reach out to find new ways to engage them and to sit down with them, talk about what's your Jewish experience been, how can Jewish London factor into that life, and what can we do to bring you more in. So yeah, that's I know we're a little short on time, so I'm getting a message here to hand it to Dan. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about vision and things moving forward, but let me make sure Dan gets some time to jump in here.
Thanks, Joe. So I am the newest arrival of all three of us. I actually only got to Canada a couple of weeks ago. I've only been in the job probably, 2 to 3 weeks. So I'm going to tell you a bit about where I come from, my experiences in South Africa, and the direct correlation between what I learned in South Africa and what excited me so much about coming to Windsor. So I'm just going to share with you here. And I'm just going to present. Perfect. So as you can hear, I do not have a South African accent. I grew up in Boston, but when I was in high school, I went to South Africa as an exchange student. When I finished university at the University of Oregon, I went back to South Africa for what was meant to be 3 months and wound up staying 10 years. Just to give you a bit of context on the South African Jewish community, I just want to show you this very quick clip because it's an extremely unique Jewish community in a very unique part of the world.
We live in an incredibly interesting country. Constitutionally, our constitution is celebrated as one of the most progressive and one of the most human rights-based constitutions in the world.
There are over 110 synagogues in South Africa. We have 56 schools, so there's a real vibrancy of life. Over 90% of South African youth attend a Jewish day school, so they're coming out from school with a very good Jewish education and a very good Zionist education.
We as Jews live a very full and meaningful life with almost no active sense of any prejudice against anybody.
So, because we're talking about the future of Jewish communities, one of the most recent survey about the South African Jewish community came out last year, and this actually is going to connect to Windsor. The South African Jewish community was 120,000 in the 1970s, and as you had even seen in the World Jewish Congress video, for decades we've been saying there's 75,000 Jews in the country. They suddenly did the first survey of the Jewish community and after over 15 years. And it turns out that the Jewish community is now down from 120 in the 1970s to 52,300 today. So more than half of the South African Jewish community has left the country in the past 50 years. I lived in both Cape Town, which you can see here, which is about a quarter of the Jewish community resides there, as well as Johannesburg, which is where the majority of the Jewish community lives. As you heard in the video, what's very unique about the South African Jewish community is the majority of them identify as Orthodox or traditional. So even though most people don't keep Shabbat, the shul that they don't go to will be the Orthodox shul, and all life cycle events will certainly be Orthodox. Majority of kids go to Jewish day schools. And in terms of philanthropy, most Jews give the majority of their philanthropy to Jewish charities. The intermarriage rate in South Africa, even though it has gone up to 19%, it's far lower than the United States, for example, or even the United Kingdom or Australia. And what's also very interesting about South Africa is the African National Congress is our ruling party since 1994. And basically, they've very much aligned government policy with BDS, with the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement. So this here was our Minister of Home Affairs, speaking while he was minister at a BDS event. This is very, very common. And this is with Leila Khaled, who is a convicted terrorist, which is very troubling for the Jewish community, given that South African Jews are so attached to Israel. I mean, you see it's 66% have a strong attachment to the country. But at the same time, close to 70% of South African Jews have heard Israel being labeled as an apartheid state. So it's a very traditional Zionist Jewish community in a country where the government is very anti-Israel. Windsor, which I'm going to get to, has lost also a lot of its community, similar to South Africa. And the majority of the South African Jewish community now lives out of the country. Where are they? Majority of them are now in Israel, but the other big destinations are Australia, the US, United Kingdom. Only 5% of the South African Jewish diaspora lives in Canada, although as we all know, Toronto does and Vancouver have large South African populations, but they're very large. And if you go to places like Perth or Sydney or San Diego or Atlanta, very large South African communities. And in this survey, they asked South Africans, why do they want to leave the country? What are they the most concerned about? As you can see, most of it is government corruption. Corruption became very institutionalized in the country during the 10 years that I lived there. It used to sort of just be government corruption that was seen as a problem, but it sort of infiltrated the private sector, and corruption has very much become a way of life in South Africa. Unemployment, our youth unemployment is amongst the highest in the world. It's over 50%. General unemployment now is around 35%. South Africa is one of the most dangerous countries in the world, which has also driven Jews to leave. As you can see, despite the anti-Israel sentiment, it's not the top reason why Jews are leaving South Africa, and same for anti-Semitism. What was shocking about this survey was that 15% of the Jewish community in South Africa indicated that they plan on leaving the country within the next 5 years. What was also interesting is that over half of those who do intend on leaving plan on going to Israel, which was never the case because the top destinations for South African Jews who emigrated, it was always Australia and the US. So that's a big shift in the community. And as you can see, within the past 12 months, over 40% of the community have considered leaving the country. So, Windsor as a community has lost over half its population. There's very strong infrastructure, but we just don't have the numbers. South Africa is very much the same story. We're hemorrhaging community members. The community is continuing to shrink. We have very strong institutions, but the question is, how long can we sustain those institutions for as the community shrinks? Just a few things from my time in South Africa that were really big highlights. The South African Jewish community tends to be very insulated from the rest of society due to apartheid and other cultural factors. So when I worked at the South African Jewish Board of Deputies in my first job, which is sort of akin to a federation, we did a lot of cross-cultural events with Black professionals, with the Greek community. This wasn't something that was very common. We focused a lot on leadership development programs. We started a program to get young people on the boards of our Jewish organizations. We got Jewish students to mentor disadvantaged students at local universities. We also, as a Jewish community, we were not participating in the wider dialogue about what was happening in South Africa. So we used our Jewish Community Center to actually host citywide debates on issues of national importance, including immigration reform, racial redress. We would invite politicians to come speak to the Jewish community about pressing national issues. And we also focused quite heavily on young entrepreneurs in the community. We found that people went to Jewish day school, but then they would kind of drop off from the community when they were starting their careers and starting families. And so we created different networks for them to meet top business people and grow their network. And it was a way for the Jewish community to actually help young people grow their careers and find new business opportunities. So that was quite successful. My second role was I moved to Johannesburg and became the executive director of the South Africa-Israel Forum, which basically took politicians to Israel. And it was very, very controversial because of the context that we operated in. This was just one crazy story. We took university student presidents from our major universities to Israel. A lot of them were from the African National Congress. The trip was kind of in secret. They didn't ask the political party whether they could go to Israel, since the official stance was to boycott Israel. But basically, we went to the South African Zionist Federation in Tel Aviv, and Haaretz published a photo of our group, and it made it back to South Africa. And we were on the front page of the newspapers in South Africa when we landed back, and the students were immediately called to disciplinary hearings and expelled from the party. So it was very controversial, the work that we did. Student leaders, there were a lot of the student leaders who we took to Israel were intimidated. BDS actually offered to pay them money not to go on the trip, but a lot of them felt that they wanted to go see for themselves and make their own decisions, and they actually went to the media and said that BDS and others were trying to prevent them from visiting Israel. Something else that was quite exciting that we did is a corporate social responsibility is mandatory in South Africa. All companies have to spend it. And as I mentioned, I was very passionate about promoting entrepreneurship in South Africa, given our very high unemployment rate. So I approached one of the banks, and we started a program that took hundreds of up-and-coming young South African entrepreneurs to Israel, many of whom had never been out of the country, to learn about how business is done internationally. This was the inaugural group we took in 2014, but we wound up really taking hundreds, and we eventually got other corporations to fund this out of their own corporate social responsibility budgets. Here they were with Palestinian entrepreneurs. One final thing before I get to Windsor related to Limud. Last year, I had the privilege of going to Iran, and I spent time with the Iranian Jewish community. And I had this crazy idea: what if we actually bring some leaders from the Iranian Jewish community to South Africa to actually talk about what it's like to be Jewish in the Islamic Republic today? And we brought them to Limud, South Africa. They toured Limud, Johannesburg, and Cape Town. It was really fascinating. So I just thought I would add that, because that was also a highlight from my 10 years in South Africa. Really quickly about Windsor before Q&A. So the population of Windsor is close to 200,000. Very similar to South Africa, in the 1970s, our population peaked at around 2,500. Today, we have less than half of the community, just like South Africa. Back in the day, Windsor actually had the only Yiddish school outside of Toronto in the province. And what's amazing is, I was talking about Jewish infrastructure. We have a kosher restaurant. We have a large seniors home. We have a large JCC. But again, our community has shrunk so much that there's a big question of how are we going to sustain all of this infrastructure. South Africa, we couldn't replenish the community because the country's not in the most stable situation, so people don't really want to move there. My goal, and this goes back to what Gustavo was talking about with Grow Winnipeg and how he started Grow Hamilton, I want us to start a Grow Windsor. I really want us to increase the number of Jewish people who live in our city. We have mild weather, we're a suburb of Detroit, and work has now become remote. So I think more than ever, we have an opportunity to attract young Canadian families from other cities, as well as new immigrants coming into Canada to Windsor. It's the only way we're going to be able to sustain this community in the long term, because a disproportionate percentage of our community is now aging. Q&A.
Okay, so the first question we have, what are the job opportunities that attract people from Toronto to each of your Southern Ontario communities? I'll ask Gustavo.
I can jump in. I think, so what we're actually finding here in London is it's not necessarily that someone gets a job in London, it's that they are either able to work remotely or they have struck a deal to move out of the cost and expense of Toronto to work, to come in once a week on the train. And so we see a lot of that happening. And then, also we have a lot of folks who sold their house in Toronto, younger folks who sold their house in Toronto and then have used the earnings from that to start a business in London. So we also see that happening.
Yeah, if I may, the same thing in Hamilton. I think it is McMaster is a good source of employment for a lot of professionals. But I think the fact that we're 55 minutes away with good traffic from Toronto, it's like a lot of people work in Toronto, live in Hamilton.
And what's very unique about Windsor is we're a 10-minute drive from Detroit. So something that's really surprised me since moving here is that many people live in Windsor and drive in daily to Detroit, and that's where they work. So I think that Windsor's great in that you get a sort of a smaller city feel. It's very affordable. But if you want big city jobs or just access to culture in a big city, it's a 10-minute drive away.
Great, thank you. The next question, what resources are there for prospective converts who live in even more remote Ontario communities who would like to connect with any of these established Jewish communities?
Well, I think today, the fact that everything that we're doing, all the programs, all the conversations, all the activities are happening online is a great opportunity for people to connect, doesn't matter where you live. But we in Hamilton, there is a lot of opportunities to attend again. We have 3 different synagogues, so you are able to attend the one that you prefer. There's 2-day schools and very affordable also compared with Toronto. So if you are a new family or you are close to Toronto, close to Hamilton, in another small city in Ontario, you are able to come to Hamilton easily. And there is some our federation actually, support the school, and that school is also bringing people from small towns in Toronto, St. Catharines or Niagara, to attend Jewish school as well. So, but the fact that everything is online on Zoom or, happen remotely, I think that it's one of the good things about COVID. I think it gave us the opportunity to attract much more people to different kind of conversations.
I would add to that, being in London, I think, you drive an hour and a half either direction to get to anything else, any other major kind of population center. So we see ourselves very much as a hub for this area of Southwest Ontario. I mean, we have people who come in from Goderich to go to synagogue here or to participate in Jewish life. And we have people who definitely come from, half hour, 45 minutes away. And that is the connection for them all the way on both lakes. I mean, that we're kind of the regional hub.
Okay, great. And last quick question, how do you find unaffiliated Jews already in your community? And actually a related question, how can you attract young families who are not interested in traditional Jewish observances?
This is my favorite topic and what I work to do all the time. One of the first things we did was really work hard to make sure everything we do is very public. So we advertise it. We are constantly trying to get press, earned media to get it out there, to get the story told. We did last summer, we did a Kabbalat Shabbat in Victoria Park, which is kind of like the central park of London, very public, and tried to get people to come. I went on the radio and talked about it in the morning. So trying to do that. I think also some of it is not as glamorous, I look through LinkedIn for Jewish names and I reach out to them. I look through every law firm at their new associates when they announce them every year. All of those kind of things. And then the other piece is just, who do you know? Who else do you know who you don't see at Jewish community stuff? And call them, ask them to share a cup of coffee.
One of the changes that we started 3 years ago is like not to have all our community events in synagogues. Okay, I think that it's important to break the barrier. For a lot of people, I learned that for a lot of people, going to this synagogue or the other, can become a problem. So we try to find like neutral places to meet. Like, for example, a good example is Yom HaShoah. It's always happening at the City Hall in Hamilton. It's not happening in any particular synagogue. The same with the way that we celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut or other big community events. We allow people that is not affiliated to come and feel welcome. And it's working very well.
Thank you so much, everyone. That's all the time we have today. Thank you to all our panelists and participants for contributing to Limud Toronto. Please remember to leave feedback in Sched and join us next year for Limud, hopefully in person. Enjoy the rest of the day.